This is part 2 of the frequently asked questions about buying fish. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I strongly suggest you start there because that video addresses more fundamental questions. Isn't all sushi fish previously frozen? Not all, but most fish that you eat in sushi restaurants has been frozen to kill parasites. The ones that don't have parasites don't need to be frozen. But please realize that they're using completely different technology to freeze those fish. They freeze them extremely quickly to an extremely low temperature, way lower than your home freezer or than the supermarket freezer. And in order to maintain their texture integrity, they have to be stored in that super freezer. Once you move them into a regular freezer, they turn into normal frozen fish. Just because your package of frozen fish that you got at your supermarket says something warm and cozy like flesh frozen at sea, doesn't mean it will not taste like junk. And by the way, if you want to learn to serve fish raw at home safely, I do have a video on that and I'll link to it below this one. Can you explain the salmon types? Which salmon are available to you depends on where you live. Since I live on the east coast of the US, that's the area I'll talk about. The most common salmon variety that you'll see in the stores here is farm-raised Atlantic salmon. It's fatty, it's tasty, it's wonderful as long as you buy it in a high-end store and pay real money for it. The wild salmon varieties that we see sometimes here are sockeye and coho. Those are both pretty lean compared to farm-raised salmon, and they're almost always previously frozen by the time I see them in Boston. And I am not a big fan of them because of their leanness and their frozenness. They often taste dry, to me personally. If you like them, that's wonderful. A really fabulous wild variety is called king salmon, also known as Chinook salmon. And if I lived on the West Coast, I bet I would have access to lots of wonderful Chinook salmon, but here we get it rarely, and if we do get it, it's usually previously frozen. Now, if you do work with any sort of wild salmon, please be very careful about parasites. Wild salmon is very prone to have tapeworm in it, so if you are undercooking it, if you're cooking it through, it's no problem. But if you're undercooking wild salmon, make sure it was first frozen to kill parasites. Since I like my salmon undercooked and not previously frozen, wild salmon is actually not a good choice for me personally, but you know, everybody has their preference. What do you do if you find a worm in your fish? Fish parasites happen. Just like bugs and all sorts of insects and worms in organic local produce happen. I already have a video about that. I will link to it below this one. It is not a cause for panic. It's just something to be aware of. Should the fish be scaled? All the fish should be sold scaled. That's my one pet peeve with supermarkets. Even the high-end ones like Wegmans and Whole Foods sometimes sell certain fish unscaled. I guess they're thinking that nobody will eat the skin, but are you kidding me? The skin is the best part on some fish. So yeah, never assume, always ask, was this fish scaled? If they say no, then ask them to scale it for you. There are some exceptions to the scaling rule. For example, small trout don't need to be scaled because their scales are so fine and so tiny, they're perfectly edible. I don't like fish bones. What can I do about them? If you're buying fillets, the only bones you might potentially still have to deal with are pin bones. Some fishmongers remove them from more popular fish like salmon, and some don't. I prefer to cut the row of pin bones out instead of pulling them out with needle nose pliers. It's faster and rips the flesh less. How do you know if the fish will have pin bones before you buy it? You ask the fishmonger. On fresh fish, they could remove them for you. On smoked fish, there's not much you can do. Do you need to buy your fish still alive? Okay, so lobsters do need to be bought alive. They produce a toxin when they die, so they need to be cooked either live or immediately immediately after you kill them. But for finfish, no way. You know, all those aquariums filled with little fish swimming around, no large fish can be stored this way. So most of those swimming fish are mighty tasting tilapia. If you like tilapia, that's wonderful. It's just, personally, I don't. It tastes a little funny to me. And again, I'm only speaking for the Boston area. It is quite possible that somewhere in the world there is some wonderful fish that are sold live. But just to let you know, dead fish are perfectly fine. Should you buy the fish whole and fillet it yourself? Well, if you want to cook it whole, absolutely, you should buy it whole. And filleting it after cooking is not very difficult. I'll link to a video below on how to do this. I already covered that. But if you want to cook fillets, just ask your fishmonger to fillet the fish for you, even if you're cooking it in 2 days. Still, ask them. You might have the best intentions, but if you don't have enough space in your fridge to store that fish and pile a whole bunch of ice around it, it will be hard for you to chill it down properly. And fish filleting, you know, is not the easiest skill to learn. So if your knife skills leave much to be desired, and even if you have fantastic knife skills when it comes to vegetables, none of that rubs off with filleting a whole fish. So I really think it's best if you ask your fishmonger to do it for you. And by the way, they can also do other things like remove the skin from a fillet. Just ask them. Tell them what you want and they'll prep it. Should you eat fish the day you catch it? Believe it or not, the answer to that is often no. No, you shouldn't. So when fish die, they go into rigor mortis. For some fish, there's not much change to texture, but other fish become stiff as a board.
Having fish iced down 1 to 2 days after it's caught, sometimes better, because when fish is caught, it goes into rigor mortis, so the fish is firm, and you definitely need to let the flesh of the fish relax, and how you do that is with temperature and time.
If you're buying fish in the store, it was already in and out of rigor, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you go fishing yourself or somebody brought you their catch, it really depends on what it is. Something like bluefish or trout are fantastic eaten immediately. There is really nothing like bluefish caught that day, but a cod and other white lean fish could really use a little rest. So ice them down for a few days before eating them. Don't freeze them, just put them in the fridge covered in ice or between ice packs. Why was my red snapper so tough even though I didn't overcook it? This was actually not one of your questions. This was my question. Yes, I have cooked fish thousands and thousands of times and I still have questions. So this terribly embarrassing thing happened to me last time I was teaching the fish class. One of our fish that we were cooking was a red snapper, and when I put it into the skillet, it just stiffened like crazy and got really tough, kind of like a rubber tire. It was wonderfully fresh, looked good, smelled good. Until we started cooking it, everything was fine. I would let this go, except that it has happened to me several times in my life, and always on a red snapper. And this time I was determined to get the answer. So I started Googling, and it turned out that many people were reporting this problem with the red snapper on fishing forums, but nobody had any answer of why does it happen or how do you make it not happen. I finally found my answer in a very thoroughly researched paper put out by Australian government. I'll link to it below. Turns out it's a condition that only affects the snappers, all different species of snappers, and it's called the tough fish syndrome. These fish are perfectly lovely when you see them raw. They smell good, they look good, but as soon as you start cooking them, the cooking method doesn't matter, they turn really, really tough. And Australian fisheries were actually losing money on this because restaurants were trying to avoid snapper because once in a while this happens, and when this happens it's not fun. So Australian government decided to research this problem and tried to find a way to prevent it from happening as often. And so what they found out that it is the age of the fish that makes the biggest difference. That's the number one factor that predicts if the fish might be suffering from the tough fish syndrome. And by age, I don't mean how long the fish was out of the water. I mean how old was this fish when it was caught. And because fish don't come with birth certificates, that's not easy to find out. So to put it all in perspective, this happens pretty rarely. But if this does happen to you, please know that it is not your cooking skills and it is not your fishmonger. It is just bad luck. It happens. Before we leave the subject of buying fish, I want to correct a mistake that I made in part 1 of this series. I incorrectly stated that each individual fish would be quarantined if that fish were to have a bacterial infection. And that is wrong. And thank you to Richard Martin from Black Pearl Seafood for finding my mistake and bringing it to my attention. So the way it works is that if there is a bacterial infection outbreak, the whole population is quarantined and treated with antibiotics. This is not done on individual fish basis. But after that fish is treated, it needs to be tested by state-certified agencies and found to be free of antibiotic before it can be harvested. I also learned the difference between antibiotics-free and antibiotics-never salmon. So all farmer salmon has to be antibiotics-free by the time it is harvested. But very few operations can pull off antibiotics-never. If there is a bacterial infection outbreak and the fish have to be treated, that farm would lose its ability to claim antibiotics-never. From what I've read, this is how it works for meat and poultry producers too. So when people are really concerned about antibiotics in farm-raised salmon, this is an issue not just for salmon. This is an issue for any animal that is farmed. By the way, if you want to see how black pearl salmon are raised, Richard sent me a wonderful video that shows one of the farms in Scotland that he works with, and I'll link to it below this one. I think now I'm really done with fish buying questions. But if there is something I still didn't answer, please let me know in the comments below. I know, I promised you guys a video on fish types and cooking methods, and that video is coming. It is up next. So don't forget to subscribe to Helen's Kitchen channel and hit that little bell button for notifications so that you don't miss that video. And if you are ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes.